We're going to begin our afternoon program at the conference. So I'm really delighted that we were able to have Daniel Blaufuks again here with us. Many of you in the room met Daniel and saw him when in 2015, 2016, we were able to have Daniel here on campus in the Twin Cities for several days, and where we did a screening of his film As Ob, As If, which was a 5-hour film. I think there is a progression here toward ever-increasing shorter films, since the film we'll see today is 10 minutes long. Soon, Daniel will have made a film in which we move into oblivion. But he has also made a number of short films as well. But the event at the Weissman was really wonderful, and so I'm really thrilled that it worked out. Daniel, actually, as it happens, had notified me that he will be in New York screening the new film that we will be seeing today, Judenrein. And so I'm also delighted that the U.S. premiere is once again in Minneapolis. He will go to New York next week, where the film will be shown at the Leo Beck at NYU at the Deutsches Haus, and he'll also be at the Penn Conference. So let me also say that Daniel is really, in so many ways, the pivotal figure for our conference on the Hyphenated Jew, as a Lisbon-born person of German, Jewish, Polish refugee family who ended up in Lisbon. He moves back and forth between Germany and Poland. He was educated as well in Germany, and is I would describe him actually as a scholar artist. So I also want to say that as we are having an artist here presenting his work, this is not an interlude from critical discourse about hyphenation, but rather someone who thinks deeply and whose work is very much informed by all of the writers and thinkers who have populated our conference and whose names keep surfacing. I want to also say that Daniel once, in one of his many publications, made an interesting point, that he's interested less in the single photographic image than in creating what he has described as cinematic prose. And while I haven't yet had the chance to see the film that we're about to see, it would not download onto my computer. I imagine that that principle is also at work. So Daniel has numerous exhibitions, both solo exhibitions as well as group exhibitions, all over in Paris, Lisbon, Rio, Madrid, New York, London, and of course in Minneapolis. And has exhibited also in many museums. I also want to mention a project of his, which is what first brought me to the work of Daniel Blaufuks, and that has to do with a book that was published with the Steidl Verlag in 2010 called Terezin, in which Daniel takes an image that's toward the end of W.G. Sebald's novel Austerlitz. And it's in the part of the novel in which there's a long reflection on the work of H.G. Adler, who I happened to be writing about at the time, and literally stumbled across Daniel's work, and that's what put us in contact with each other. But as a result of that work, that through Sebald, his entry into the world, the really quite magical novelistic world of H.G. Adler, he did a massive installation in Lisbon that I had the good fortune of being able to visit 3 years ago, and it's called All the Memory of the World, Part 1, which of course draws as well on Alain René's film, All the Memory of the World, Toute la mémoire du monde. That is also one of the major voices in Sebald's film. So he's influenced by writers such as Georges Perec and Sebald, and René and others who are interested in exploring this notion again of cinematic prose. So Daniel is both photographer, video artist, filmmaker, and writer, holds a PhD as well. And I think we are really in for a very interesting afternoon with Daniel, who I will now invite up to speak. He's going to speak briefly, read a text, and then we'll watch the film, and we'll then all have a chance to discuss it. So please join me in welcoming Daniel.
Thank you so much for this too generous introduction, Leslie, and for having me here again in Minneapolis, also to the other conference organizers, Bruni, Daniel, and so forth. Thank you so much. I always feel like a wild card at these events, but I also profit from that and I'll use that. But for the academics, I will start with a quote, actually, for a text that I wrote for today. And it's a quote by Georges Perec, which I think speaks a bit on your interest in the hyphenated Jew. Perec wrote, I don't know exactly what being a Jew means, what it does to me. It's an obvious fact, if you like it, yet a mediocre one, yet a mark that links me to nothing either precise or concrete. It's not a sign of belonging, not linked to a belief, a religion, a praxis, a culture, a folklore, a history, a destiny, a language. It is an absence, rather, a question, a throwing into question, a floating, an anxiety, an anxious certainty behind which there is the outline of another certainty, abstract, heavy, insupportable. That of having been designated as a Jew, and therefore as a victim, and of owing my life simply to chance and exile. So that's Georges Perec, and I'll go into myself. I am not sure I qualify as what you call a hyphenated Jew, but I am definitely a European Jewish artist. I was born in Portugal as grandchild of German and Polish refugees who were not strict in their religious ways, but felt as Jews, who were persecuted for being exactly that and probably became more Jewish because of that. Even so, we only attended the Lisbon synagogue on high holidays and lighted the candles only at Pesach Seder, where I was always the youngest in a family of 5. That is my heritage, and so it is also unwillingly my moral commitment as a person and as an artist. My work has therefore developed into a kind of poetic account of my daily life in relation to passing time and memory, with the obvious weight of the Shoah that always casted a shadow behind my steps, as if to grab me into its abyss. As I grow older, that shadow became somewhat dimmer, but other shadows seem to be growing menacingly, now in front of my steps rather than behind. Was it so in every generation? Probably. As Benjamin remarked, every generation thinks it is facing the end of the world, but in reality we are most likely just facing the end of our times, which is perfectly natural, alas. But what distinguishes me as a non-religious Jew, hyphenated or not, in today's Europe? Is it my culture, my kind of humor, my love for old cafes, or is it my fears? When I grew up in fascist Portugal, no one around seemed even to know what a Jew was, besides those who had been burned long ago during the Inquisition. My schoolmates were always highly surprised I didn't have a real Christmas celebration, although my mother, as a secular German Jew's daughter, not only always had a tree for us, but also had a real one, since she was a secretary for one of the bosses at Volkswagen in Lisbon, and they would import a few original Tannenbäume from the Black Forest that could beat any of those meager branches from pine trees used by the Portuguese. But at school, however, they could also not really understand why I didn't go away on holidays to the village of my grandparents, like everyone else seemed to be doing. They could not fathom that we were only 5 in the family, in a country where families extend easily to dozens of cousins. And that my grandparents would not go back to their towns where they had lost everything. I don't think I could then understand it really either. I was, by the way, also the only one with divorced parents, something a Portuguese Catholic couple could not face. But then came the revolution, hundreds of divorces, and new kinds of movies. Foremost, Woody Allen, a name that one should not avoid pronouncing in the US, I am aware. But anyhow, these films arrived one per year with all those Jewish characters, their funny accents, and so forth. People now had at least an idea that there were other beliefs besides the Catholic consensus, and sometimes they would even ask questions about rites or festivities. Not that anyone among my friends ever remembers to wish me a happy Jewish New Year or a happy Hanukkah, But still, I'm sure the Chinese, the Muslims, and the Indians don't get any greetings on their holidays either. Nowadays, it is again somewhat different. Every time the Israeli army kills a Palestinian, people expect me to have an opinion. Every time I give an opinion on something on Facebook, someone turns it around to discuss the Palestinian issue, even if the original subject was the murdering of Jews in the diaspora by some white nationalists. I am not asked if I ever went to Israel, or more to the point, if I ever voted in Israel, or even if I agree or disagree with Israel's current policies. I am not asked how I feel as an European Jew, as if the Holocaust was something that only happened to my grandparents and did not cast a shadow. It is similar with colonialism. People think it ended from one day to the other, basically on the day the former colonies gained their independence. I get insulted at times just for being a Jew, mostly virtual insults by friends of friends. Then, maybe even worse, there are those who think, knowing I'm Jewish, that I automatically agree with everything they have to say about Israel or Palestine, no matter how radical it is. So that if I had to choose between my so-called friends and my so-called enemies, I would rather run away from both of them. On the other hand, if I go to the synagogue and meet my fellow men and women, I feel I am surrounded by hardcore pro-Israel Jews who won't admit any criticism on the political situation in the Promised Land. Hopefully I am wrong. There might be someone who thinks differently, but there is a sense of group that should not be challenged. More so because the Israeli ambassador is often invited to speak at religious services, making this bound between faith and political beliefs even stronger. And one doesn't want to be ostracized from the synagogue and the community, especially when it's the only one in your country. As an artist, I am strongly aware that one can only compromise up to a point with the powers of a state. I remember the difference between a Zara Leander and a Marlene Dietrich. This also partly explains why, as a Jewish artist, haunted by memories of the past I have the fortune not to have lived, I am forced to continue to work on the reminiscence and the debris of the forsaken people, on the trauma, but also simultaneously on the joy of being alive. So that we remember what we need to forget. It is not about if what once happened will perhaps happen again. It is about the mechanism which made it possible that is still functioning in similar ways with equally frightening possibilities. What would Europe have become if there hadn't been such a destruction of some of its own people by its own people, its own cultures, and its own architectures? Where would we be now? We shall of course never know, but it's a fascinating exercise to dwell on these dystopian alternative realities. Anti-Semitism, as any racism, is not new, we know that. It was here long before Israel, and it will always be here. It is, however, also fueled by Israel, because we are connected to it by an umbilical cord that is used against us. So hyphenated or not, pro-Israeli politics or not, we are all in the end Jews, plainly Jews, that were born so, and thou share something we can now hardly define. For a long time, I think, we were defined by the Holocaust, by common past and stories, who came from where and when, and the cousin of a cousin who survived. The food that is surely Jewish, but also German, Polish, and Middle Eastern. We shared something that was beyond religion and maybe could be explained as a shared hope. Hope that the world had learned its lesson and we had survived as a people, strongly wounded, but revived, even if in dwelling numbers. Now we need, I feel, to redefine ourselves once again, because it seems to me we share another, albeit not new sentiment, and that is fear. Or at least a pessimistic view of the future. That might not be too bad, as my grandfather used to say. The pessimists were the ones who survived, and the optimists were the ones who were sent to Auschwitz. And if I might add a personal story, hoping that I don't offend anyone, I was once, while researching the Holocaust in an archive in Germany, almost crushed to the wall by the shells concerning the letter A, the Auschwitz section, rotated carelessly by a German functionary. I can thus confirm that only my faint cold saved me from being crushed in Auschwitz at the hands of a German dutifully doing her job. Jewish or not, humor helps us, indeed, but it won't get very far. It won't go very far in dealing with life in a humorless world. I've also not forgotten that my grandfather, Herbert August, once also told me what he thought was the difference between a Jewish and a non-Jewish child, being mainly that a Jewish kid gets all his questions, even the most idiotic, seriously answered. That alone might be the key of success for a great culture. We should keep it that way and must continue, as adults, to ask questions and further questions. Some questions might not even have answers, but they must be nevertheless asked. And some answers haven't found their questions yet. I think that is what I try to keep doing in my work. And that is, in the end, what defines me as a European Jewish artist. Not hyphenated, since I feel strongly each one of them separately, while striving to be a mensch. And now I'll show you a film, and we can talk about it after. I don't remember where I have this film from. Probably from the time I was buying random reels of Super 8 on eBay and in flea markets. Usually they were more or less amateurish images from family holidays or celebrations. Mostly German, since they could afford it, but also British, American, Brazilian, and French. Once, I also bought an entire collection from a Portuguese family. Their travels resumed in 30-odd 3-minute reels, London, Paris, New York, and so forth. However, this film was somehow special, and that is probably why it never left my mind. These images were different, although still probably done by an amateur. There is no family, no children, no honeymoon. There is no beach, no picnic, no sightseeing to be seen. There is no obvious reason to film in what I could discern at some place in Eastern Europe, Poland perhaps, Hungary maybe. So finally, I went back to the film and was able to slow down the frames, to be able to read the sign with the name of the town, Klin-Mo-Tov. Starting from here, it was easy to find out that the reel was filmed in a village with now 2,000 inhabitants in south-central Poland, not too far from where my own family came from. But when? And by whom? And why? The more I look now at this film with its road, peasants, and horse carriages, the harder it seems to establish from the images alone an exact time frame. These must have been filmed already in the 80s, but everything seems to be from a long time before that. We see the people coming out of what is certainly a church, one by one in their best Sunday clothes, some staring defiantly towards the camera, and others ostensibly avoiding its gaze. I see their faces, and I feel they show mistrust and discomfort toward either the camera or the person behind it. Am I seeing too much in these images? Do they recognize the outsider? Is it an outsider? In 1914, more than half of the people in Klin-Mo-Tov were Jews. There had been first a wooden synagogue, and then, since 1860, a large stone one with a cemetery next to it. In 1939, there were 3,100 Jews in a population of 4,000. There was also a Jewish school, a Jewish hospital, a Jewish hospice, additional prayer rooms, a Zionist and a socialist organization, and Jewish libraries. Nevertheless, there have been continuously manifestations of anti-Semitism. In 1927, the police chief terrorized the Jews, insulting them on the street. In 1930, all 3 Jewish restaurants were closed. In 1936, Jewish businessmen were paralyzed by a ban. All this contributed to the growth of Zionism, and in 1938, many young left for Palestine. On September 13, 1939, the German army entered Klimonov. The Jewish homes and stores were plundered, and in October the Jews were ordered to pay an enormous amount of money. Most were taken daily to forced labor. In March, the SS burned the Jewish books and prohibited the Jews to have access to wood or coal. In October 1942, the Germans and the Polish police gathered the Jews in the market square and marched them to Zlota, 18 kilometers away, shooting the elderly and the sick on the road. From there, they were boarded on trains to Treblinka. The remaining 5 disabled Jews of Klimonov were murdered, and the town was declared Judenrein, clean of Jews. The ones still in hiding were kept like animals and often killed like one. I read. When 6 of the Jews managed to return to Klimonov, they were killed, among them a pregnant woman in a house on Sandomierska. This was in April 1945, a month after liberation. In 1946, there was once again a pogrom in the countryside not far from Klimonov. 40 Jews were killed by peasants and members of the community. The killings took place openly and attracted a crowd of onlookers and bystanders, and after that, many went to celebrate with vodka. I read, one victim allegedly said to his murderer, a childhood friend, "We ate with one spoon, and now you want to kill me?" In the following years, the communist school books largely ignored the Holocaust and focused on Polish martyrdom. The 125 Jewish properties had meanwhile passed somehow into the hands of their former neighbors, where they still remain to this day. And life went on in Klimonov. But then, why is this woman hiding her face from the camera with her handbag? Does she remember? Does she suspect who the man behind the camera might be? Who is the man behind the camera, and why is he filming this? Is he one of them, or a rare tourist, or perhaps someone who came back? The story of the Jews of Klimonov is told in this amateur film by their known presence. They are in between each and every frame. They are present in the silence of this silent movie, in the fragments of every image, perhaps even mirrored in the faces of each one we see here, and maybe constantly on their minds as well. As anti-Semitism, racism, and fear of the other are once again rising in Europe, let us not forget that these sentiments were here all along, always here, waiting for their moment to arise once again. The archives contain not what we remember, but what we have forgotten, or at least partly forgotten, or remembered mistakenly. That is why we need the archives, to retrieve memory, to clarify memory, to extract memory from artifacts such as these images. Whoever shot this film was in search of something, a memory perhaps, or more unlikely, a guilty face of recognition. In fact, this film must have been made more than 30 years after the war, at the full height of communist ruling in Poland. Soon, everything would change again. The film itself, however, of the peasants of Clermont-Auvergne leaving the church, reminds me now of other films in history, such as the one of the workers leaving the Lumière factory in Lyon, or the images of the Theresienstadt Jews walking like ghosts in their invented town in the fake documentary made by the Germans. Film, as photographs are, is a memory of a memory. Once there were Jews in Clermont-Auvergne. They are no more. Okay, so it's just a glimpse of my work, what I'm trying to do with old stories, but still present stories. And this film, I bought this film on eBay many years ago, like I say in the voiceover. And these are the images that never left my mind, so I kept thinking about them, that I should have to do something with them, and it took me years to understand or to gain the courage actually to touch them, you know, because this is the problem with film. Film always has an agenda, a point of view, even if it's an agenda that is even unknown to the filmmaker. There's always a point of view what the filmmaker wants to do, even if it's a hobbyist amateur, which is probably the case here, a simple tourist. And in a society of images as we are in now and already for some time, and will stay in for a long time, I fear, we need to be able to read images, not to be ignorant about the images that are served to us and come to us. We need to understand that images are an alphabet, that we have to learn it. We seem to take it for granted that images are something that crosses, and we talked this morning about translation, and we seem to think that images are something that don't need translation, but they do need translation. They need to be explained. They need to, as we have in the Terezin Nazi film that probably you all know about. If the images are served just like that, they still function in their power of propaganda, of fascist and humiliating propaganda. But this also happens with more innocent images that are made today and are shown on TV, on cinema, constantly. You know, like anywhere we go, and this is not an American problem, it's a world problem. We are served images without sound. They're constantly in front of us, behind us, or surrounding us. And I think this film, tries also to touch that issue, that we need to face the fact that we're analphabets in the front of the images that are given to us daily by cameramen, often only by cameramen who are just filming because they have a salary to do so, but that's already an agenda, you know, and we all know that from TV channels, from cinema, from countries and so forth. I don't know if you want to.
So yeah, I wanted to just pick up on a few things, and then we'll open it up. And that is, since you mentioned, I was also thinking Daniel did. Yeah, I think you can all hear us. So as part of the Terezin project, Daniel also took there are 14 minutes or so that were found from the Theresienstadt, from the so-called documentary that had been done. And Daniel did a really interesting project, and I certainly see parts of that in here. he took that 14 minutes of footage, because there's also a section in Sebald's Austerlitz when the main character is musing on whether or not he would ever be able to find his biological relatives, and so there's thought of what it would be to slow it down for 90 minutes. So Daniel actually did that. He took the 14 minutes, slowed it down, and colors it red, which is another interesting project. The other thing I wanted to mention that I also see here in this, and maybe you'd want to speak a little bit about it, because of your interest in Georges Perec, I have always understood and read Daniel's work as being deeply a sort of visual counterpart to the idea of the lipogram. So as many of you know, Perec was interested in the lipogram and creating the literary text that is constituted by its absence, so eliminating in Perec's case the letter E from the novel La Disparition, which figures in the exhibit that I also saw of yours in Lisbon. And so that idea of creating erasure, of putting erasure into the present of the text, and we have that here, of course, with the first frame, the last one, and then periodically rewrite it. It seems to me that's, I don't know if that's an homage to Perec exactly, but it seems it's maybe present in your...
It's not an homage, because I don't think about directly about these things, but it's like I say, the Jews, this film could be, this short little film could be called La Disparition, because as I say, the Jews are there in between those images. The Jews are gone, they're dead, they were sent away, but they're there. You know, they're phantoms behind these images. And I'm sure that woman is not holding her hand back because she wants to show her hand back. She's hiding her face, definitely.
Exactly. And the other thing, and so it just strikes me that so much of your work, that Perec is so present, I mean, literally present in some of the other projects. My favorite one, I'll just mention, because I love this one, where, so Daniel took the footage of Godard's Breathless and removed Jean-Paul Belmondo from the text. And so, I mean, that was more of a different, playful erasure, sort of lipogram, creating a lipogram text in a very different way. But you have a number, you know, it figures in a number of works. The other thing I just want to say that probably visually we might all have had the associations when you see the line of people coming out again and again and sort of on that kind of continuous loop, the way filmmakers like Farocki, for instance, have worked with that documentary footage from Westerbork as on the way to Theresienstadt, that we're reminded of those processions of the people out there who are in the process of being deported, number one. And number two, it seems to me to also visually cite the Germans who were forced, you know, the footage that was taken by American cameramen at Liberation. There was one in Bergen-Belsen famously where the Americans are, I mean the Germans, are forced to witness, to see. And so you have documentary footage that shows again and again, you know, this, you watch people watching and being forced to confront. So I don't know if that was on your mind. And then of course this wonderfully sort of disjunction between the people we're seeing and then these sort of visual cues and reminders of other cinematic moments in which very different kinds of people, of course, are being paraded.
No, yes, definitely. And when you say that about the film in Bergen-Belsen, you know, that there's also an absence in this film, in the British film that you probably saw, where Hitchcock co-worked, and also in the Alain Resnais film, Night and Fog, that the Jews are not mentioned there. The nationalities are mentioned, but not that they were Jews. And that, you know, raises a lot of questions. Why weren't they mentioned? We're probably speaking here about British anti-Semitism after the war, which this film also speaks about. It speaks about Polish anti-Semitism after the war. You know, in April, just a month after the war ends, the Polish peasants were again killing Jews. You know, and this is not about judging. It is about understanding what happens even after such horrors. You know, how can you come back from a concentration camp and then face your neighbors and get killed by your neighbors? I mean, it's like, but we're all humans. I mean, this sounds a little bit ironic, and it is ironic, but we're all humans, so we need to understand these mechanisms, why people function like this. That's why I try to say in the text, the Holocaust is important, but what is more important is the mechanism that made the Holocaust possible. This mechanism is the same mechanism that is working now in Brazil, for example. Not that it's going to raise to that scale, but the way people get elected, like Bolsonaro, is exactly the same. Hitler gets elected with radio, and I'm not going to speak about other elections, I'll speak about Brazil. In Brazil, it happens because of the internet, and because of mixed virtual mingling with reality. So the mechanism is still very powerful, and it's the same mechanism.
So we have a number of hands are up. So let's see, Bruno.
Yeah,
good of it.
Thank you very, very much for this very poignant testimony. So you seem to have a distrust for images, and which I find quite interesting for someone who works with film and images. And so I wonder if you are using the text that you're reading, basically, or that you're writing and then read as a sort of way to conjure away the images. And if you think that the text, the writing, Georges Perec, and so on, are more faithful to bear witness to the disparition or the erasure. And if yes, why is that? Because I can understand a sort of distrust for the society of spectacle and some kind of leaderboard type of thing. So I wonder if you are...
Yes, no, definitely. I think the task of the photographer now is not to take pictures. It's to think about the pictures and not necessarily to take them. But the problem with the image is not the images themselves. The problem with the image is that the way we see the images, we see the images too quickly. Nobody stays in front of an image and tries to find the different layers to the image. We do that with text. We still do that with text, or some of us still do that with text. So in that way, I trust much more text than I will ever trust an image. I think romantically that literature still has the power of changing the world. I don't think art, especially photography, has that power anymore, if it ever had. Because I think we're immersed by images, by exhibitions, by museums. We go there like we stroll in the park, which is very nice. I love to stroll in parks. But it doesn't make me really think like a written text. So in that sense, I'm much more confident in reading and trying to write, not like, and someone like Georges Perec, who obviously was a writer, but I see him also very much as an artist. I think he was an artist, and his medium was letters.
And movies.
Mm-hmm.
And movies.
And movies.
Yes.
Yes.
For
Yes.
example,
Yes.
which is also a movie about absence.
Lonquidor.
Yeah.
So, and even Sebald, I worked, and I put together Perec and Sebald. Sebald, in many ways, was also an artist in the way he used the photographs in the books. And we are much more focused on the text in Sebald than we are on the images, which makes it also interesting, because in the real world, we're much more focused on images than we are in text. I don't consider the university the real world. But outside, images come to us much more easier. They're like flashes. They're like, we go out, we see advertising, we see a newspaper, we see Instagram, and they're always lying. Images are always lying. If I want to show to my friends how it went in Minneapolis, I would photograph only this side of the room. It's so much more full than this side. I never show these empty chairs. You know what I mean? So images are constantly lying to us. We never think about the moment before or after the picture was taken. We never think about that the picture is just a frame. There is something to there, there's something to there, there's something upstairs, there's something downstairs. We don't think about that. We don't have that capacity. Our brains stop inside that frame, and that usually very quickly. So I mistrust the images very, very much. And Mo Nagi was an artist, photographer, and Bauhaus teacher. He wrote that in the future we will all be analphabets. He wrote that in 1920-something. So, and it makes more and more sense to me. And the more we're flooded by images, the less we have the capacity to absorb them.
At the same time, you say we have to learn the alphabet of images.
That's our only hope. It's
Yeah.
like, if we're flooded, we need to learn to swim.
Okay.
So it's the same. I think we're going to drown in images. So that's also a hope, because maybe we get over this love or whatever we want to call it for image and find something else. Because images more and more become like a pictogram. Do you say pictograms? Yes, in English.
Yeah.
Like something very, like WC. Images are like that. We read them really quick. We see WC, we don't think. We see exit, we see a man walking, we know we have to go there. And pictures became pictograms in the last years, which brings us back, in fact, to cave paintings, to cave drawings. So we're kind of going backwards and not forwards in many ways.
First of all, thank you. This is extremely powerful, and I was trying to figure out the source of the power.
The source of?
The power of the film, and it seems to me that it's someplace between the image and your narration, so that your narration doesn't quite tell the story. It opens up the possibility for questions for the images, and I don't really know what my question is, except, is that intentional? Is that something that you were thinking about? Were there things that you kept from us? Because I was thinking about the ages of the people and who was where when and what's being transmitted. I was thinking about those flags and what those flags meant, what went on in that church before they came out. The woman with the purse could have been hiding her face for any number of reasons. You direct us in one direction, but maybe she was there with somebody she shouldn't have been there with, or maybe she should have been there.
That goes a bit too far.
I don't step on it. So I just want to thank you for, instead of closing it down with the narration, you open it up, and that for me is very exciting.
And this is to say, I don't know much more. And all the images, the only thing I did, so the only change in the original film is obviously the slowness, that I slowed here and there. And the name of the town actually comes at the end in the original film, so I brought that to the beginning. But otherwise, there is no editing in this. I mean, there is no mixing the images like back and forth. And there was only a very small frame that I left out because you couldn't really understand anything, So basically, this is the film. So I worked on this is the 3 minutes of a Super 8 reel, transformed so that it will go to 10 minutes. But I don't know much more.
But you could have made up a story.
I could have made, but that's also about the danger of images. I couldn't have made any story. In a way, it's also like, there's a Brazilian song, like a Tedo Veloso, where he says, and I find that very interesting, he says, just this sentence, in the photograph, we are all happy. And it's like, in all families, we have these happy families photographs, right? But then we hear that the uncle did that, or, the mother did that. So, but we're happy in the photograph, but there's so many layers there that we don't know about. In any family picture, that we have no idea. Maybe it was horrible for those children. And they're all smiling, because you really have to face the fact that pictures don't tell you the whole story. And you can make it up. You can make it completely up.
Okay, so I think the order is Sarah, and then you, and then you. Yes, Sarah.
I think my question follows on what you just said, but I guess I'd love to hear you reflect on the difference between what you're doing and documentary, because I guess as I understand the way many documentaries function, the idea of putting images with something historical that we already know makes you feel like you were actually closer to the event. And yet, I feel like there's a tension in what you're saying, and I guess I want to hear you explain it, because for me the tension is that you're talking about the alphabet of images, and as though we could learn to unlock them, and yet you've given a story that you have to be aware as the viewer is imposed upon these images, and so we have to be aware of the fact that, in fact, those people are never going to be able to tell us why they were looking away from the camera, and in some sense, you've closed off our capacity, and the fact that the film has been released into the universe the way it was has closed off our capacity to know. So can you explain to me how the work that you do as narrator, insofar as it's unlocking this alphabet, how does it unlock the alphabet as opposed to the way a documentary would play?
I'm not sure it does. But,
Okay,
but
so then what would it mean to unlock the
yeah,
alphabet?
my problem with documentaries nowadays, although I love documentaries, but my problem with documentaries is, maybe I'm wrong, but I feel more and more the filmmaker has an opinion on something, and he's going to search for the images that justify that opinion, and builds up his case. And we, as viewers, if we have the same opinion, we go out and say, oh, what a great film. And if we don't have the same opinion, we go out, what a bad film. But we're not able to be convinced by a document. We might be informed of something we don't know. So documentaries are still very important because I might learn about something I never heard before. But if it's something we already know, it's not going to change our minds. So I lost a bit my faith in documentary in that sense. And again, I lost my faith in image, and I was a photographer, I am a photographer, I take pictures every day. But I'm not a faithful photographer.
But if I can also just interject, I mean, I also think we have to understand this as a found object,
Yeah.
sort of within the tradition of found footage in this case, or I would say the larger genre of the found object, in which both the origins and the destination, become really what constitutes the artwork and the power of the artwork. That's how I would understand its relationship vis-a-vis documentary. I mean, the primary thing I found on eBay, as you said, no less. So, so where its origin, where its source are already, that sort of unknown.
It could fit into fiction. I mean, everything I said that it's true. It's true as far as I read it and I researched it. But it could be fiction. It could be absolutely fictional.
So that, can I just ask,
Yes.
so that all makes sense to me, so I just want to hear you say more about what it means to learn the alphabet of images, because to me there's a tension between everything you just said and that claim. I don't understand how they fit together.
It's to be conscious that we are influenced by images.
That's what it
every day.
means.
That's what I mean. And try to make an effort to not to be, like, how do you say, you don't judge a book by its cover, don't judge a photograph by its image, by the image. There's much more to it than just the flatness of the paper.
More hands, okay, back here, Katja, here. No, that's next. Okay, yes, back.
There's a strong association with the film with the image of the Catholic Church, including the three papal flags, yellow and white, to the side. How would you feel if in researching each one of the faces, you find that one or more have been just amongst the Gentiles and have helped Jews?
It doesn't make a big difference in the fact, because I'm not nominating them. I'm taking a mass of people that belong to a village, Like when I say the Americans, doesn't mean anything. There are Americans who have completely different opinions.
So you're using a means like film to generalize from a little sample to a Judenrein, place.
But the historical facts happen in Klimonov. What each one of them did, each single person did, is not put into question. I'm not going to judge people by people because I don't know what I would do myself. In my film Under Strange Skies, which is about the Jewish refugees that came through Portugal, specifically my grandparents, I have an image of my grandfather at the end of almost at the end of the film, and I asked, what would have happened if he was not a Jew? So I don't think we can judge because we'll never, and I hope we'll never be in the same situation. So I don't know, I'm lucky that I am a Jew in that case because I'm the grandson of people who were on the right side at that moment. But also because they were Jews, I don't know. My grandfather was very German. Would he have been in a fascist party? I hope not. But can I be sure of that? I cannot. So I don't want to judge anybody, but The danger is also we as a community, we as a people, we as a country. You know, so this is very hard when we speak about a country who was in a war. Like I don't judge the Germans. I mean, I lived in Germany for many years. I have very good German friends. I don't think we can really judge. We can give them the power of responsibility. As like I was born in Portugal, so I feel I have responsibility towards the African countries that were colonized by us. Because when I grew up, I profited indirectly by going to schools that were financed by this money, by whatever. You know, the whole country was financed by what was happening in Africa. Not one of my family was ever in Africa, but that doesn't mean anything. I belong to that community, so I think we are responsible for that. We're not guilty. It's a difference. I think it's a very strong difference between being guilty and being or co-responsible, let's say. You know.
And on that note, if I can just draw our attention to the fact that we're in the president's room of so-called Kaufman Union, I'm just very struck, as Daniel was saying, we're surrounded by the men whose legacy has come under great contestation in the last year or so, really raising exactly these questions of what it means to be then part of a larger community, whether or not one was him or herself actually to blame. But there was, you were next.
Yeah, that's what you said. Let me just touch our unconscious, the unconscious, and we're not aware of the feelings and the thoughts that those images bring to us. And along with this, I just wanted to say to us, it seems that anti-Semitism, it goes up and down. It lies dormant for a while, then it goes suddenly. And I wonder if anti-Semitism and anti-Semitism is an essential part of Western culture.
I think it is. It has to do with crisis. It has to do with crisis. It has to do with the economic crisis that we face in Europe. I mean, I'm speaking for Europe. I think white nationalism in the United States is a different issue than what is happening in Europe, which has to do with economic problems and the facing of refugees, not Jewish refugees, but African, mostly African and Syrian refugees. So anti-Semitism is just, another side of it, and of course of misconceived ideas. I remember in Portugal, it's not that long ago, there was an article, for example, an article on Man Ray, the American French artist. There was a big exhibition, and there was a sentence, and this was the best newspaper in Portugal, and there was in a critique of the exhibition, said a sentence like, Man Ray, because he was Jewish, he did not accept checks, he only accepted money. And I was like, hey, I'm Jewish, I accept checks. And so I wrote to the newspaper, and they took it. Things like that, or on a different spectrum, there was a series of assaults on gas stations. So every time there was a gas station assaulted by Africans, they would put by black assailants. Assailants. And when there were Portuguese assailants, they would not say they were white. So often, obviously, this feeding of information that is not wrong, but is also not right. And I think the same goes for anti-Semitism. every time there's an article on George Soros, we get informed that he's Jewish. You know, and in Europe that plays a role. That definitely plays a role. If a Jewish beggar is murdered on the street, they're going to say it's a beggar. They're not going to mention he's Jewish. You know, so it goes on and on and on. But I don't think there is a cure for it. I don't think there is. I think we should face racism and anti-Semitism as part of human nature, and not pretend that we're going to eradicate it ever. We have to live with it and work with it. I mean, maybe I'm being too, you know, but I don't. Like I said in the text, after the Shoah and up until now, I think we're all hopeful. And now I think our hope is kind of fading away. But we also have to defend ourselves in ways that maybe were not the ways we did in the past. You know, people have to understand we're just people. Anyone is just, you know, and there are rich and poor and so forth. But it's difficult. It's very
I'm sort of maybe in a slight position to one of the reactions heard. I felt that your declaration doesn't open the narrative, it closes it down. Basically, you show us the pictures, and you say, this film is about the fact that there are no Jews here. And basically, kind of any film, in particular Asian film, in time, when we know the time when it is in a sense a film about that there are no Jews in the world. So in that case, it was a rural place, and there was a church, and so even without your narration, if I were looking at those images, I would most probably think of borders. Because of how I was brought up, because of my background, because of many different reasons, I would probably think of borders. But your action, at least to my mind, is an action of not erasure or on the contrary, you put the eye, you put the dot on the eye. You say what is missing here is the Jews, and I'm telling you that what is missing here are the Jews. So it's a very particular act, very strong act, and a very particular manipulation. Now I'm saying manipulation not in the derogatory way at all, but just to describe what you do as an artist, as a filmmaker. So my question is really how, so this is the first time that we've seen it, but maybe your other works with similar strategies. What is the, how do you envision this work will be received? Because how it will be received, or how do you think that it's a very particular action, and in a particular cultural climate now, it seems to be very uncomfortable action. And here I refer back to what Leslie just said about the room in which we are in, and how this, even this particular scandal, how it developed in the last few months. With indecision, right? So they didn't change the name, right?
It's not a decision. It's a very decisive
Or
act.
a very particular decision.
Yeah.
But so it seems that your work here is in its decisiveness. To say this is what it is about is a kind of very uncomfortable work.
But don't you think in a place where in 1940, which is not very long ago, my mother was already born in 1940, so we're talking a generation before, half of the population of this place were Jewish, and now there's not one Jew, that absence must be a presence.
I don't have an argument with you at all.
No, I'm just saying, I'm just saying, but we have to face that fact as well, to acknowledge it happened. It's there, you know.
So what reactions do you get from people when you say this is what we need to do?
I don't know if we need to, I think we need to, I never showed the film in Poland, where I probably would get very strong reaction. I don't know if they would show it in Poland. That's another question. But I think, and that's very Perekian, where there is a presence, there is an absence. And we have to acknowledge it. that absence before even we acknowledge the presence. Because the presence goes directly into our eyes, but the absence is a ghost. The absence is a ghost, and Zebald was a master in that. The absence is something very strong that is like a fog, like a leaf cast on top of us. And we don't know why, we don't know how, but we really have to face that fact, that these people have gone. These people have gone, and not because they wanted to leave. And even if they have wanted, we have to face the history. We have to look at the past so we are able to see the future. In that I believe very strongly. As long as you continue living as if nothing happened, as long as we continue living in Portugal as if we were not a colonialist country for 500 years, as long as in the United States people don't face the fact that black people were very mishandled in this country for many, many years and probably continue to be, we cannot move forward. There is no peace possible if we don't just face it. We don't need to say my father. It was my father's fault. It wasn't. It was the time, whatever. It's not about trial and judging. It's about being conscious about these facts. That's, I think, is what the film is about.
I can also just add, though, it seems to me that it's the dissonance between the faces of Polish Catholics emerging from the church that we are forced, to look at with the voiceover. That it's in that it's a dissonance. I see it as reductively. I'm saying dissonant in a positive sense. So that dissonance, I think, creates the jolt in a sense. We're not seeing yet again footage from the camps. We're not seeing again the Bergen-Belsen and the Germans being forced, to observe what they had done, but rather we're seeing the absolutely quotidian, moment from a moment in the 1970s, I gather. So I think that dissonance actually shifts then the voice-over with its imperative, and which seems to be what you're hearing more, that imperative or somehow that strong voice that we are, that there is this absence, So I think creating the visual coming against it, it opens it up. There was another hand, yes.
Right. You present a context, you do it with narrative. There's also, to the very keen observer, the very aware person, the very historically inclined, and whatever else you want to say, maybe there's a context that's apparent without any words, just by looking at the film. But I think the narrative has a lot to do. That narrative plus the film together results in a tremendous emotional impact. And I'm thinking, as I say that, about the civil rights movement in this country and what happened in the late 50s and early 1960s. And what finally gained traction was when Walter Cronkite, CBS News, went down to Alabama and took pictures of dead and blown up buildings, dead people, and pointed a finger at where the problem was. Not a right or wrong, it could be either way, which is, well, I don't swear, but that they're just right and they're just wrong in what was going on. That was clearly wrong. Until that happened, this country was not ready for what happened 2 years later, the Voting Rights Act and the civil rights legislation that opened the way for so many things to change. Not to say that the job is done, but things have changed. And I think when I saw this, I personally, and maybe some others did too, I felt like I should be saying Kaddish from what you saying Kaddish from what you presented here. And I think maybe that's what you were saying too, that there's a very definite emotional impact that drives people to action, just like happened in Selma, Alabama, when that was filmed and Cronkite did his narration and so forth. And I think, eventually more and more people will get the idea of what's right and what isn't with regard to anti-Semitism. But there's clearly a right and a wrong there, and I think your film points it out. I think that's a lesson for us.
But when neighbors kill neighbors, this brings us to a lot of questions. How can this happen? It's not only anti-Semitism. Obviously, they were also interested in their properties, and it said that 125 properties
It's
are
a
still.
complicated issue. I mean,
It's a very
not
complicated
just
issue.
that, but
It's a very
the bottom line
complicated
is that
Yeah.
anti-Semitism is a bad thing.
Oh yeah, no, that.
But why couldn't you, since you have a lot of questions about the film and who's there, who isn't, aside from the fact that the presence and absence from a filmmaking point of view, I would say, well, this is the fabula, this is the backstory. So the backstory is left to the audience, and they fill in the questions. It could be a question of metaphor, metonymy, whatever, the umbrella, the newspaper in front of her face would lead to other. Why couldn't you have gone with someone like Agnieszka Holland, gone to that town and asked the people, well, if you want to make a social valid, 30 people, what they were supposed to be doing regarding feeling about the other, and then getting answers. Then you wouldn't have had questions. And Lisbon did that at one point when they had the polemic 10 years ago with the nuns in front of the Auschwitz church, and they were not supposed to be part of the whole thing. Anyway, I was just curious, as a thought experiment, you would have gone there, you wouldn't have had questions, you could have answered your questions.
I thought that about the terrorism film that you saw as well. You can talk to people, but I don't think you get the answers. There are no answers. What can you say? What can you possibly say about what happened?
But when you keep pressing them as an interrogator.
But I don't want to be an interrogator. I don't want to be the bad cop or the good cop. I don't want to be in that position. I'm reading from the images, and I'm reading history from the images. I'm fictionalizing things that I read that are supposed to be true. I can take that luxury because I'm an artist and not a documentary filmmaker, journalist, whatever. I also can take that luxury as the grandson of Polish people that were driven out of the country, so that gives me some whatever. So I can take that luxury. I don't want to ask people, if you're going to away from war, if you're going to ask a murderer, why did you kill that person? If he answers because he had money, or because I hated him, because I wanted to have his cow, that doesn't answer anything. We all, I want to have money from whatever, and I don't kill. I want to have someone else's wife. I'm joking, but I mean, you're not going to kill just because you want, because you have that desire. There is something more strong than that. And that cannot be answered, that could be maybe answered by a psychologist, but that cannot be answered by the man or the woman themselves. So I'm not after a cinema that answers questions. I'm after, and it's not even, I don't even call it cinema. This was done on my computer without any, effects. It's a commentary. Like the other film I did, I said this is not a documentary, this is a commentary. So it's a personal.
Documentary itself implies 50 different kinds of documentaries.
Yeah, of course.
Reportage, you've got socially conscious documentaries, you've got poetic documentaries, you've got stuff like the early
But you've seen, I don't know about here, but I imagine it's the same. When someone is murdered in Portugal, in a building, and then the television, they rush over there, and they ask the neighbors of the building, of the murderer, not of the person who was killed, but the murderer. They all go and say, oh, he was so nice, he always said good morning in the elevator. That's always what they say. He was such a nice person. nobody could foresee that that was going to happen. It's normal people who kill other normal people. It's not the lunatics that we see on the street. They're harmless, most of them. So this is not something that can be explained by words. It might be explainable by feelings, and that is something that images can raise, as you know better than me. Images can raise feelings, and through that they can raise possible answers. But it's impossible to answer questions, why did it happen like this? And I mean, we see Germany, and we always have that thing, oh, Germany was the center of European culture, it was incredible, and then something like this happens, in Germany of all places. You know, like in Austria we now have a fascist, the Italians are again, you know, going to the right. Can you explain it? I go to Italy, I sit down, they give me the best wine, they're the nicest people in the world, they speak with their hands, as we all know. Can you explain why, you know, I don't think we can. I don't think we can. And that was the problem with Perec. Perec could never explain why he, as a French writer, was among all these people that had actually given his mother to the Germans to be killed in Auschwitz. He could never explain. That's why he never faced in his writing directly. He's always like this, you know, the E that disappeared and so forth. These images are about the E that disappeared. But, you know, you cannot explain.
All right, so we have very little time, quite a few hands. I'd like to suggest that I take 3 more questions, comments. We'll let Daniel respond, and then we can continue the discussion in the very brief break we have before we move to Shaul. So Shaul, David, Chad, and Daniel. So quickly, 4 comments. We'll take the one right after
Okay,
that.
I'll try to be, I'll be quick. I want to kind of push you in a different direction. This is obviously very, very powerful and very, very evocative. But I want to push you because I think there's another danger here. And on the one hand, I understand understanding the past, seeing it, experiencing it as a way to move forward. But the occupational hazard here is that these kinds of films actually are simply a perpetuation of trauma, and not a perpetuation of trauma and not an overcoming of trauma. It's an inheriting of trauma, that in fact, it doesn't let you move beyond it. And that in some way, and I think this is an experience of speaking as an American Jew and somebody who cares a lot about these kinds of things, there is a way in which these, and I'm not criticizing the film, I'm talking the genre itself embeds trauma so deeply in a collective psyche that we actually can't move forward. So, you know, it's interesting you brought up Kaddish. It's very interesting that there is within the Jewish tradition an end to mourning. You don't mourn forever. At some point you get up, you stop saying Kaddish, and I think it's an important thing to think that after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, the rabbis decided that this was not going to be the center of our religion. Mourning the temple was not going to be, there was going to be a time and a place for it within the liturgical year, but I think, you know, as much as I appreciate what you do, I think there's a way in which what you're doing in some way, and you're not intending it obviously, it makes it more difficult to actually move forward.
Well, that raises all sorts of questions about function of art.
Right, yes, no, of course.
I would want to push back up, but we don't have, so David, and then Chad, and then Daniel.
So I always enjoyed listening to your films, and the thing that was so striking about this was that how loud the silent footage was, and I felt that was a metaphor for, it seemed to me what you were trying to do is to make the silent speak, to make the invisible visible, and I'd love to hear from you about that, but maybe there's not a moment right now.
So let's collect the last decision. Daniel.
I'll also try to be brief. I like the film very much. Watching the film and listening to you talk about the film reminded me of something that Marx says somewhere, where he says that every emancipation is a restoration of the human world to human beings themselves. And it seems to me that you're trying to do something like that, you're trying to de-reify images or undo the reifying work that images do. And it seems to me you're doing that. You identified 3 ways in which you're doing that. One is simply pointing to the absence of these images and showing how that absence is itself a product of human activity that's left out of the frame. The second, you talked about the framing work that the photographer does. And third, you talked about the reception of the viewer, the receiving work. And all these ways you're restoring that humanity, that human activity, which is too often forgotten or left out. And so I guess the question is, do you see this as a kind of an emancipatory project that you're engaged in trying to undo the reifying work that you suggest images do so much of in our world today?
So many interesting commentaries and thoughts, but Daniel, I'm going to give Daniel the last.
I'll defer my, because people sort of ask in
that's-
different ways.
All right.
So I'll try to resume. I agree totally with the trauma. However, I don't think I personally, and probably still my generation, can overcome that trauma. It is a trauma.
Right.
But I also think the film is not necessarily I mean, I felt impelled to do this film now also because of the refugee crisis, obviously. So when I say something like facing the other, we mentioned the other. I think that's the center of the film, in fact. So for me, it's not necessarily. I mean, we are here on a conference about hyphenated Jews and so forth. But the film, for me, it's also about facing the other, which is a very important key to what is happening in Europe right now. So I take also the Jew as an example, as a metaphor of the other, because it was the even if it was the neighbor, it was the other. So that's it. But I agree totally with you. But I think the trauma would only be overcome by the next generation. I think they overcome. I mean, at least when I am with younger Jewish people, including in my family, I see they function completely, totally different. So I think they overcome that trauma. Maybe not all of them, because it depends also on their relation to their family history. But I feel there is, something completely, a complete different approach. About the sound that David mentioned. Well, I wanted the film, that's why I put this Super 8 sound. I wanted the film to be silent, but I don't want it to be awkwardly silent. So I thought about this, which I already used, as you probably remember in other films, the Super 8 going back and forth. But the main idea of the film is that I won't be here, obviously. You would see the film, but you'll get the idea that I am talking to you at that, showing you the film like on an editing thing. So I'll go back and forth, or I'll go slower and quicker. So like I said, the film is made on my computer in the same way I think it should be seen, not in the sense of the computer, but as a lonely experience. Even if you're in a group, and I won't be here, it is a lonely experience. And for that, I thought about making it completely silent, only the voice, but especially in the missing frames, in the black images, it gets really awkward in the room. So I decided to have at least that idea of, which is also an absence when we're projecting digitally now. It's also the absence of cinema. Used to be, some noise at least, which is the projector noise. We're now missing that. Now I forgot completely
Whether you see this as, it's in a certain sense, as an emancipatory project, in the sense of restoring kind of human activity or consciousness of human activity that gets lost otherwise through the reifying work that images do.
It is, and I should maybe say, and it comes, I think, a bit towards what you're saying and asking. This I did also as a test film for another film I want to do, which is about the absence of my father, which is a project I have called Non-Father, where basically my father disappeared when I was 2 and I saw him a few times. And how does that puts in perspective the whole, like a friend of my mother said, we lost so many in the Holocaust that we do not here like your father did. And because he also shunned his childhood friends, and he remarried a very Catholic woman and so forth. And that film is about missing images, because I found out I don't have one image with my father together. There's no, that I could find. The only image that I could find where I was with my father, and I actually used in the Under Strange Skies on the refugees in Lisbon, is a picture of my brother, me, my mother, and my father is cut out probably by my grandmother after the divorce. So that was the only proof that we were ever together. And then I have a 8mm film from my grandfather that he never showed to us. He had this collection of, I don't know, 8 films that sometimes he showed to the kids, and we loved when he played it back, and you could see the people walking back, And when he died, I got the films, and then I found out, oh, the first reel, what must have been his first film, which, because it's the only one in black and white, is still with my father. But it's before I was born, so I'm not there. So I want to do a film about that and about the absence of image, because we also need photographs for ourselves, which raise enormous questions about the digital imagery of today. But that's another thing. So this film was a bit of a test as well on these black holes. What do you do if you don't have any image? Where are we? And I'm always not surprised, but yet surprised that when people need to save quickly something from their houses, like in the Bosnian War, or when the house is burning, they most likely will grab the photo album, which is something we don't have anymore because now it's on Instagram. So also our mindset will shift with technology, obviously. But the lack of image, and this goes for me and my father, but it goes for any family, and it goes for any state, for any country, for any society. We need images. For any university, we need this kind of images to convey the feeling of whatever tradition, happiness, that we are here and we're following the footsteps of the ones we were before. So this, in the sense, it's also about, and again, the absence is also the lack of images of Jews in this town, because I couldn't find them. Maybe they are. I didn't go into Poland to search the archives. They might be, but they're not obvious. They're not obvious. And I was also interested in this question about after the Shoah. What happened after the Shoah? Why did the Jews go back? The tragic is that some Jews did go back. Because I always ask, why did my grandparents never went back? So and it's obviously also about trauma that they could not go back because, but some went back. There are many stories that Jews went back. Some ended up living back in, I don't know about Poland, in Germany. Hans Rosenthal became a famous talk show on German TV, primetime TV, and he was a Jew who came back. So these differences also make me, think. But this is, again, and just maybe to finish, this is a personal film. It's me. It's an opinion. It's a column in a newspaper. Anyone can think differently, and I will agree because this is so personal that it's not. It's not a block of cement. It's a pudding that we can mix
and keep talking about. And I think this conversation has demonstrated how very rich it is. Thank you to everyone. Thank you most of all to Daniel.